You need big muscles to punch hard. One of the most common myths in boxing is that you need big muscles to punch hard. Rolly Romero has talked about this directly on camera, and he's far from the only fighter who's pushed back on it.
You think I got the physique for boxing though or not?
Yeah, hell yeah, bro. Dude, all that muscle shit don't help anyone.
Power in boxing comes from the kinetic chain. The legs driving up through the hips into a rotating torso, with the arm acting as the final delivery system. Big arms add weight without adding torque, which is why heavyweight bodybuilders almost never punch like trained boxers, even when they outweigh them by 50 pounds. Deontay Wilder is the clearest modern proof. He fought most of his career around 220 pounds at 6'7", with arms that looked thin compared to almost every heavyweight he faced. He still finished 42 of his 43 wins by knockout, including a one-punch demolition of Dominic Breazeale in May 2019, where Breazeale ate a single right hand and was unconscious before he hit the canvas.
For having the character to throw with him and
Wilder hit Breazeale so hard, they are feeling it in Breazeale!
Bermane Stiverne in their rematch went down 3 times in the first round, and the fight was over in under 3 minutes. None of that came from muscle mass. Tommy Hearns earned the nickname the Hitman the same way. He fought at welterweight, around 147 pounds, with arms so visibly thin that announcers used to comment on them mid-broadcast, and he still walked through Pepino Cuevas in August 1980 to take the WBA welterweight title with a second-round knockout. He went on to stop Roberto Duran cold in June 1984. You need to spar to be elite. The idea that constant hard sparring is the only way to build an elite boxer falls apart the moment you look at how the best fighters actually train. Vasily Lomachenko's father, Anatoly, built his entire early development around folk dancing, tennis, juggling, and breath-holding drills. Sparring was treated as one small tool in a much larger system, not the foundation. Lomachenko finished his amateur career 396-1. Won 2 Olympic gold medals, and is widely considered one of the most technically gifted boxers ever to lace up gloves. Gennady Golovkin's longtime trainer Abel Sanchez took a similar philosophy into the professional ranks. Sanchez deliberately limited hard sparring in the second half of fight camp to around 9 days total, calling it sparring preservation. His reasoning was that hard sparring rounds shave years off a career, and the damage should happen in real fights, not the gym. Triple G went on a 23-fight knockout streak between 2008 and 2017, the longest in middleweight title history, with a chin that famously never cracked. Then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Floyd Mayweather would go 12-plus rounds of sparring a session, sometimes pushing 14, occasionally with no timer at all, just boxing until someone quit. He rotated through 15 to 20 fresh sparring partners, swapping bodies in as the rounds piled up. He retired 50-0 with 5 division titles. 2 fighters built elite careers on completely opposite approaches to the same activity, which means sparring volume itself isn't the variable that decides who becomes elite. Boxers peak in their 20s. The idea that boxers peak in their 20s and fall off in their 30s is one of the most repeated lines in the sport, and it gets disproven at the championship level over and over again. George Foreman is the clearest example. He lost his first heavyweight title to Muhammad Ali in October 1974, retired 3 years later, and then came back at 38 years old after a full decade away from boxing. In November 1994, at 45 years old, he knocked out Michael Moorer in the 10th round to win the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history. Moorer was 26, undefeated, and had outboxed him for 9 rounds before Foreman landed a single right hand that ended the fight. Bernard Hopkins did it for even longer at light heavyweight. He won the title from Jean Pascal in May 2011 at 46 years old, breaking Foreman's record as the oldest fighter to win a major world title. He then defended that belt successfully and kept fighting at championship level until he was 51, beating Tavoris Cloud for the IBF light heavyweight title in March 2013 at 48. Hopkins built his entire late career around defensive mastery, ring IQ, and conditioning, traits that don't decay the way raw athleticism does. Hopkins also famously fought Kelly Pavlik in October 2008 when he was 43 and Pavlik was 26 and the undefeated middleweight champion of the world. Hopkins won every round on every scorecard, walking Pavlik down for 12 rounds in one of the most one-sided fights of that decade. Southpaws have an unfair advantage. The southpaw advantage gets repeated like it's a law of physics, but the actual win rate data between orthodox and southpaw fighters at the professional level is roughly even. The advantage isn't built into the stance, it's built into exposure. Most gyms have far more orthodox fighters than southpaws, so orthodox boxers spar southpaws less often and have less time to figure out the angles. When a southpaw faces another southpaw, or an orthodox fighter who's been drilling southpaw counters his entire camp, the advantage disappears. Marvin Hagler is the cleanest example of this in practice. Hagler was a natural southpaw and fought most of his career from that stance, but he was actually ambidextrous and would switch to orthodox mid-fight whenever he wanted. Going into his April 1987 fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, Hagler started in orthodox and stayed there for most of the early rounds, partly to neutralize the idea that his southpaw stance was doing the work for him. Leonard ended up winning a split decision in one of the most debated fights in middleweight history, and the southpaw narrative didn't save Hagler's record. Manny Pacquiao is another fighter people credit to his stance, but he beat orthodox legends like Oscar de la Hoya, Miguel Cotto, and Ricky Hatton through hand speed, footwork, and angles, not because they couldn't read a left hand. Hatton in particular had spent his entire career fighting orthodox opponents and got knocked unconscious in 2 rounds in May 2009 by a fighter whose advantage was timing, not handedness. Headgear prevents concussions. Headgear feels like it should prevent concussions because it pads the skull, but the science says the opposite. AIBA, the governing body of amateur boxing, banned headgear from elite men's competition in 2013 after their own internal studies showed concussion rates went down once it was removed. The reason is rotational force. Concussions happen when the brain rotates inside the skull on impact, not when the skull itself is struck. Headgear pads the surface, but it also enlarges the head, giving punches a bigger lever arm to twist the neck and rotate the brain. Teddy Atlas has been one of the loudest voices against headgear in serious sparring for decades. He's argued repeatedly on his podcast and in interviews that headgear gives fighters a false sense of safety, encourages them to walk into shots they would normally slip, and ruins the defensive habits that keep a boxer healthy long-term. He trained Michael Moorer to a heavyweight title and worked under Cus D'Amato in Tyson's early development, and his stance has always been that the gym shouldn't simulate safety that doesn't exist on fight night. Freddie Roach has run the Wildcard Gym in Hollywood since 1995 and trained Manny Pacquiao through every major fight of his career. And he's followed the same logic. Pacquiao famously sparred without headgear for the back half of most camps, and Roach has said he wants his fighters seeing punches the same way they'll see them in the ring, with no extra padding distorting distance or reaction time. Undefeated means you're the best. A 0 in the loss column gets treated as proof of greatness, but the record on its own doesn't tell you who a fighter avoided or how the wins were managed. Rocky Marciano retired 49-0 as heavyweight champion in 1956 and is still cited as the gold standard, but he never fought Sonny Liston or Floyd Patterson, the 2 most dangerous heavyweights coming up behind him. Historians have spent decades pointing out that his title reign was carefully matched, with most defenses against fighters past their prime or below championship level. Floyd Mayweather finished 50-0 and was barely touched doing it. His team negotiated ring size, glove weight, drug testing windows, and opponent timing across his entire career. He didn't fight Manny Pacquiao until May 2015, by which point Pacquiao was 36 years old, 6 years removed from his prime, and fighting with a torn rotator cuff he had surgery on weeks after the fight. The win counts on the record, but the version of Pacquiao that beat Ricky Hatton and Miguel Cotto was long gone. Gennady Golovkin outlanded Canelo Alvarez in 10 of 12 rounds in their first fight in September 2017. Most independent media scored it for Triple G. The judges called it a draw, and Canelo's unbeaten streak survived a fight he didn't win. Undefeated only means the scorecards never said you lost. Longer reach always wins. Reach gets talked about like it's the deciding factor in any fight, but the heavyweight division alone has spent the last 50 years proving otherwise. Mike Tyson stood 5'10" with a 71-inch reach, shorter than almost every heavyweight he faced. He still ran through the division in the late 1980s by closing distance with head movement and exploding into the pocket before taller fighters could establish their jab. Trevor Berbick was 6'2" with a 78-inch reach when Tyson knocked him out in 2 rounds in November 1986 to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history at 20 years old. The reach gap meant nothing once Tyson was inside. Joe Frazier had the same problem on paper against Muhammad Ali. Frazier stood 5'11" with a 73-inch reach against Ali's 6'3" frame and 80-inch reach. In their first fight in March 1971, Frazier walked Ali down for 15 rounds, dropped him with a left hook in the final round, and won by unanimous decision. Ali's reach didn't keep Frazier off him because Frazier's whole style was built around slipping the jab, getting under it, and working the body once he was inside. Roberto Duran had a 66-inch reach at lightweight, short even for his division, and built one of the most feared resumes in boxing history off pure pressure and inside fighting. He stopped Ken Buchanan to win the WBA lightweight title in June 1972, and went on to a 13-year run as a champion across 4 weight classes, often fighting taller, longer opponents and walking through them in the pocket. Boxing is dying. Boxing has been declared dead every few years for the last 2 decades, and the actual numbers keep telling a different story. Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson in November 2024 drew 108 million live viewers on Netflix, the most streamed sporting event in history. The most watched Super Bowl ever peaked at 123 million on traditional TV with full network distribution, advertising, and a national holiday built around it. A YouTuber boxing a 58-year-old retired fighter on a single streaming platform did more than half those numbers with none of that infrastructure behind it. The stadium business is in the same shape. Anthony Joshua versus Daniel Dubois at Wembley in September 2024 drew 96,000 fans, the biggest post-war boxing crowd in British history. That wasn't a one-off. Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk in Riyadh, Canelo Alvarez headlining Las Vegas cards every May and September, and multiple Saudi-funded heavyweight nights have all sold out venues that promoters couldn't fill a decade ago. Saudi Arabia is the reason a lot of these fights are getting made at all. Turkey Al Sheikh and the Public Investment Fund have spent billions purse-funding fights that promoters had been talking around for years. Usyk versus Fury in May 2024 became the first undisputed heavyweight championship fight since Lennox Lewis held all the belts in 1999, a 25-year gap that ended only because Saudi money put the purses on the table that both sides were demanding. Street fighters would beat trained boxers. The idea that a tough street fighter would handle a trained boxer falls apart the moment the street fighter actually meets one. Kimbo Slice built his entire reputation on backyard YouTube knockouts in the mid-2000s and was treated as a real fighting threat until he stepped into legitimate competition. In his October 2010 fight against journeyman boxer Roy Nelson, Nelson took him down and ground him out for 3 rounds with basic technique. A year earlier, Seth Petrozelli knocked him out in 14 seconds on national television in October 2008. The myth ended the moment trained fighters got to test it. Art Jimerson at UFC 1 in November 1993 is the example everyone forgets. He was a legitimate professional boxer with a 29-5 record at the time, and he walked into the cage wearing 1 boxing glove on his lead hand because he didn't know what to expect. Royce Gracie took him down in under a minute and submitted him without throwing a real strike. Jimerson's boxing didn't fail him, his lack of grappling did. And the lesson there is that boxing is a complete striking system, not a complete fighting system. Against another striker with no grappling, the boxer wins almost every time. Trained boxers also have something untrained fighters never build, which is conditioning to being hit. Years of sparring teach them to stay calm and counter through real punches, while untrained fighters almost always freeze or panic the moment they take a clean shot. Weight cutting is just dieting. Weight cutting in boxing has almost nothing to do with dieting in the normal sense. Fighters spend the final week of camp dropping huge amounts of water weight through saunas, hot baths, and full-body sweatsuits, often losing 10 to 20 pounds in the last few days before stepping on the scale. The weight comes back overnight through controlled rehydration and carb reloading, with most fighters entering the ring 15 to 25 pounds heavier than the number they weighed in at. Canelo Alvarez's team has talked openly about his protocol. He water loads with up to 2 gallons a day for several days, then cuts water intake completely 24 to 48 hours before weigh-in, while his sodium and carb levels are manipulated separately to push fluid out of his cells. He typically weighs in around 168 for super middleweight fights, and is back in the ring the next night closer to 180. The whole process is closer to a controlled medical procedure than anything resembling a meal plan. Oscar De La Hoya has talked about his cuts in even more brutal terms. In interviews, he's described eating nothing but a small piece of chicken a day for the final stretch of camp, while still running, sparring, and hitting pads at full intensity. He fought at 130, 135, 140, 147, 154, and 160 across his career, and the cuts to make 140 and below in his early years left him so depleted that he later said he was fighting on empty before the bell even rang.